Hi there. Recently, I had someone reach out because they had an attendance management problem. It's a common challenge for any business, really, not just small businesses. And attendance management is what I'm going to talk about today. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, and this is the HR Hub. I am an HR consultant to small businesses, and this is the kind of thing I talk about with my clients. Usually on my show, I do episodes for HR practitioners, but this series is targeted towards small and medium-sized businesses and not-for-profits, or even solo HR practitioners. As a consultant, this is my client base, and I'm going to share some of what I know with you. So today I'm talking about attendance management. So why is this critical? If you're watching this, you might already be frustrated, and you aren't alone. I've met a number of small and medium businesses whose viability is being affected by the attendance or lack thereof of their employees. It's not really that surprising that your productivity is affected when your employees don't show up. And worse, if that employee is the one who's unlocking the doors, maybe you're not even opening the doors when you're supposed to be. I've also seen it affect the well-being of an owner as they're constantly trying to cover shifts because someone hasn't shown up. And it affects the other workers as well, and just the general vibe, I should say, of the workplace. And ultimately, it's the customer experiences when those workers repeatedly have to cover and get resentful, and that resentment trickles through into the way they provide service to your customers. So by managing attendance, you are actually going to help morale. So if it's affecting your business, it is a problem you need to deal with. You have the right to manage attendance and ensure operational efficiency, but how you do it matters a lot. If you adhere to some fairly basic principles, it is straightforward, but it's when attendance issues don't resolve through those initial efforts that it gets super tricky. So listen up. Okay, so the first question I'm going to address is what kind of absences are covered by attendance management? So there are two types of absences that are typically addressed through attendance management. The first may be chronic lateness. I say may because it really depends on what the reason for the lateness is. But of course, being late happens to everyone now and then. The problem is when the lateness is recurrent, it's happening over and over, and it gets quite disruptive. And it's especially disruptive in businesses that are, in a sense, time-bound. They've got a lot of time-based commitments like deliveries or opening the store. Now, lots of lates could be a sign of a serious problem like burnout or a medical condition. It can also be a sign of poor planning. And if it is a sign of poor planning, then you might be taking a more disciplinary route to that kind of lateness. The second type of attendance that can be managed through an attendance management program is those chronic unscheduled absences. Let's make some up. These might include a car breaking down, a sick kid, a sick parent. And all of these absences individually are valid, but accumulated, they add up to so much disruption for a small business. In some cases, like a sick family member, there are lots of jurisdictions that have laws that cover this and require an employer to give leave to that employee. Again, it's when it adds up that you have an attendance problem. It bears restating, but attendance management can cover and does cover all kinds of valid types of leaves that you as an employer are required to permit. These might include compassionate care leave. Lots of jurisdictions have legislation covering this type of leave, or bereavement leave, or sick leave. The problem with any of these is when they add up and the person is away from work a lot and you're having a hard time getting your work done. Attendance management isn't discipline. We are not punishing, not that discipline is really punishment either, but we're not punishing someone for all of these things that happen. It's when those things start to really impact work and impact their ability to meet the commitment they made when they signed a contract with you. So Some examples of when you might discipline an employee related to attendance is if that employee calls you up and says, "Oh, I broke my leg," and that afternoon you see them running on the beach. Or if they get their buddy to punch the clock for them, quote unquote, punch the clock if you've got that kind of system, so that they can go home 15 minutes early. These are cases of lying and failing to meet their basic obligations as an employee. And some of those examples I just listed are actually quite serious. And so discipline up to and including termination could result. You might also want to get very suspicious of absences that are patterned. And I will get to data keeping, but data keeping in attendance management is super important because patterns will emerge. So if someone's taking the day off before a stat holiday, or they finish vacation and they get sick, and that seems to happen a lot, these are things that are more headed towards the disciplinary route than attendance management because they're fault-worthy or there's a certain degree of blame involved in that kind of behavior. Attendance management also does not apply to absences that an employer has the right to approve or not approve. Like, think about vacation. This is because an employer can deny someone's vacation and ask them to take it at a later time. But I get that sometimes with vacation added in, it feels a lot like the employee is never there. Speaking of managing it, we have to talk about how you're going to deal with these attendance issues. First of all, you need to start with appropriate policies so that employees understand the expectations. A lot of times as a small employer, you may not have these policies, but that is where I would start. The policies should cover everything from working hours to procedures for calling in late or calling in sick. Now, policies, of course, are not going to solve an attendance problem, but they are going to create objectivity and a sense of fairness in how you manage the attendance. Now, I am going to suggest that you offer flexibility if you can. This isn't possible for all employers. So say if you have, for example, a dad who's often late, but that's because he has to drop his kids off at school, and with traffic, he's often getting in at 8:45. Now, if you have the option, shift his hours. You'll likely get his gratitude, and, at least in Canada, you might be obliged to do this anyway because of human rights legislation. So once you have policies, then you need tools to track attendance. You need to be confident about the time off that someone is taking and what they took it for. As far as you know, documentation and data is really key. 2 months down the road, when you're having a conversation with this individual, you don't want to go, was it the 8th or the 9th? Or was it the 8th and the 9th that this person didn't come to work? You also want to know if they said their car broke down or their kid was sick or they were sick. Those things become very relevant in managing attendance. Now, some systems that might help you, your HRIS might help you, a payroll system might help you. If people scan in your workplace, that's going to help you understand when they are scanning in and scanning out. However, and I know that a lot of small employers don't often have amazing data, and that isn't going to be a problem, at least initially. There certainly are things you can do, even if your data isn't that strong. But once you know you have a problem, ideally, you're going to be tracking the person's name, the date of this absence, how long the absence was, and what they said about why they're off. Now I want to talk about the conversation you need to have with someone who is absent a lot. So when you have someone who's been unable to attend work on a whole number of occasions, of course, excluding vacation and other things you can approve or not approve, you need to start by talking to them. A lot of the tips I'm going to give you about that conversation are very basic. The first is keep it private. If you're in a cubicle type environment, don't have this conversation with them in their cubicle where it can be overheard. Then sit down with them and say you need to talk to them about their attendance and acknowledge their track record. Hopefully you have some data on hand that you can refer to. You need to express concern because remember, as far as we know, these absences are all quite valid. So express concern for the individual, but also express concern for the impact it's having on the workplace. Then, without asking for a diagnosis, ask them if there is something that's keeping them from being able to meet their commitment at work. You should commit to trying to help them solve the problem and discuss solutions, again, without discussing a diagnosis. I've said that a couple times now. I should talk about some limitations. These limitations are certainly relevant in Canada. I don't know about elsewhere. In Canada, we're not allowed to talk about diagnoses. That's private information. We are not allowed to know about restrictions, work restrictions, or prognosis, or the length of an absence, but not specifically about the diagnosis. A lot of times employees will volunteer this, and you should be making them aware that they are not required to advise you of their diagnosis. However, I will say that if information is offered about the absence, write it down. Just make sure that you are keeping this information private and in a secure location. Once you've had this conversation, I would expect that the attendance is going to get better in the majority of employees. However, if it doesn't, it is one of the trickiest areas of HR, in my opinion. I would recommend that you get help. There's just too many ways to undermine your own efforts on behalf of your business. And this is mostly in Canada because of human rights language that prevents an employer from discriminating against any individual on a protected ground, which would include disability and family status. If someone doesn't show up related to any protected reason and doesn't show up on a regular basis, you will have a duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. I will put a link in at the end of the show to an episode I did on the duty to accommodate if you're curious about that and want to understand better what that is. However, if an individual's absenteeism relates to a disability or any other protected ground, even a little, you have to consider your duty to accommodate. And this is complicated, so please reach out to an HR consultant or an employment lawyer for a discussion of your options at this point. But I do believe that a conversation with most employees will help turn a situation around. And I think I've given you the skills you need to have that conversation with the employee just in this discussion here today. As I said earlier, I am an HR consultant, and if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. So that is it for today. As I said, I would link to my discussion on the duty to accommodate, and that is right here. I have done other episodes for small and medium businesses, and one of those is right there. Thanks for watching out there, and see you next time.